Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back for the second session of the day. I have the delight to introduce Danielle Jablonski. I met Danielle a year or so ago, actually, at an industry event. A very knowledgeable speaker, excellent presenter. So I won't beef you up too much, Danielle, but I will pass over to you. I know you're a member of many cyber boards, and I look forward to your, well, we all look forward to your session. So thank you very much for attending, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Darren. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Danielle Jablonski. I currently work at a company called Nozomi Networks. Nozomi Networks is a cybersecurity solution provider for OT and IoT, offering asset inventory, vulnerability management, threat and anomaly detection. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and I do volunteer on various boards and with organizations focusing on operational technology, industrial control systems, and otherwise cyber physical systems and security. I'm going to turn off my camera for the majority of this presentation until Q&A. And I'm sharing slides now. There's just a bit of a lapse here for the slides to populate. Do we have slides? Okay, let's see. Okay. We're going to be talking about smart cities, cybersecurity trends and challenges today. This is obviously a very broad topic and we won't be able to cover everything, but I hope to provide some caveats here on what types of technologies and deployments we actually think of when we talk about smart cities, what their security concerns are, and how we can begin to overcome some of the challenges when we think about securing smart cities deployments. So to begin, smart cities have various market drivers that are not the same as every other industry out there, with increased connectivity and the quote unquote digital transformation. So similar ones include more data equals more opportunity. People are looking for solutions where efficiency is key, availability, redundancy, and fast connected communications are paramount. They want to lower their cost of operations at the same time that they increase connectivity. And the way that they do that is typically looking at cloud scale deployments where you can do a lot more with the computing power provided with a cloud provider. And you can also share the responsibility of securing your cloud depending on which deployment you go with. There's also the drivers of automation, big data, and 5G. These are, again, just kind of the high-level caveats to the markets that we're seeing, but these are adopted variously by different industries. Business agility, process optimization, and artificial intelligence or machine learning-driven insights and analysis have become really the talk of the day, and also the investments we're seeing for the next 5, 10, 15 years. When it comes to security, these increased number of devices really kind of amounts to more vulnerable access points because they're very simplistic devices typically. It increases the attack surface just in the amount of devices, so a sheer number of potential attack targets and vectors for access. Ultimately, many of the deployments we see are either have understaffed security teams to own and operate them, or there's third-party assumptions of who owns the security and the risk associated with these deployments, or there are staff that are trained to use and even program and configure some of these devices that have no security training. The devices come with security disabled by default, and nobody at the integration level really teams with the staff that are trained to use the devices to actually configure and deploy security features on the devices. These devices are connected to legacy infrastructure throughout smart cities deployments and different market segments and departments of cities. Sometimes they operate in siloed organizations. I've seen before where a police force will actually purchase 2 different sets of an IoT vendor device for the same use case and not know that the other one had already purchased it or purchased a separate solution. There are disparate security technologies that overlay on top of these deployments, and there's some financial exposure, and we'll get into that a little bit more down the road. So I've just rattled off all of these high-level trends and challenges and market drivers, but the bottom line is we're moving data as a whole from where it's generated to where decisions need to be made, right? That's how we get to more data equals more opportunity, efficiency. But we only need to move data as needed. So we don't need a bunch of frivolous data moving around for no reason. And the data that we do move and utilize day to day should depend on the use case and the critical functions. And that should be specific to the deployment and specific to the city. And again, the security concern is we need to reduce the amount of frivolous data moving around, not in support of a specific use case, like I mentioned. This is also a value proposition for some of the other security technologies in the world. And the most consistent theme throughout my research on this subject with experts that was repeated in a ton of interviews I did as an analyst is we need to apply security policies to data flows and not try to secure every single device at the device layer, because that becomes unattainable over time. So I mentioned use cases. What does that really mean? Typically, when we think of smart cities deployments from an IoT perspective, we're thinking of meter systems or kind of counting systems, camera systems. So these are use cases involved in urban innovation and design, the attempt to have more people enjoy their lives in cities and have society be more prosperous and efficient. Smart connected energy, which is involved for metering for consumption potentially, and some weather productivity. Smart connected water, same thing. Smart connected mobility is kind of the autonomous fleets of vehicles you see not only for commercial transit, but also for transportation for critical manufacturing and provision of necessary goods for other sectors. And so I'll actually have an example later for autonomous trucking that is becoming very popular in the US in many test beds. We have smart connected buildings, which is kind of obvious, right? We see a lot of centralization of the operation of buildings in terms of their HVAC and their elevator and their smart gardens and watering and efficient lighting and those things coming together. And finally, smart connected government, which is actually the number one customer today of smart cities deployments. So what we're seeing in this industry is that vendors of smart cities use cases, meters, deployments, and IoT are aligning these solutions to specific city priorities. So cities will demonstrate specific value propositions to their stakeholders, whether that's the Department of Commerce, whether that's their business district, whether that's their citizens, and they'll present a business case for purchasing and deploying certain smart cities capabilities. So again, to kind of rattle off some examples of this in a city, you might see brief cams, video analytics, traffic monitoring, connected vehicles, pedestrian monitoring, heat mapping, smart lighting, facial recognition technology, security analytics, connected HVAC in buildings, EV charging stations, everywhere from Target to the courthouse, smart meters, location info and GPS mapping, Bluetooth beacon tracking, some biometrics deployments, and smart applications for products and services where you maybe don't have to use any technology to check out of a store. You can pay with Amazon, those kinds of things, and many types of wireless networks to deploy these various systems, meters, and use cases. Now, I've said meter a couple times. Those of you who have a security background will remember there have been quite a few botnets in the world. The Mirai botnet is probably the most famous, but there have also been many tests cases by security researchers looking at meters and the ability to deploy botnets. And some botnets that have been deployed in these test labs will attack the firmware of the devices, manipulate insecure firmware, insert malicious code, and potentially even override the update capabilities. So not only will they replace the firmware with malicious code to spread this attack to other nodes in the deployment, they will also then delete the code that allows somebody to then update it after they go in to remediate this type of attack, which means a technician will actually have to go in and remove, rip, and replace these deployments, which means you have to replace them wholesale. So you have to completely go in and take them out and purchase new ones and replace them. Another type of attack is really kind of the simplicity of hard-coded passwords on these devices. And there's limitations in just the amount of storage that they have for even cryptographic signed passwords. So even if the passwords are kind of secure, there's limited space to make them longer, which is an increased concern for security down the road. So just again, to give some more context for where we're seeing these deployments, here are a couple of different bullets per city around the world where you can see smart cities use cases deployed today. And the number one issue that cities need to understand when they are deploying these, even if they're potentially small deployments, is that an attack on one component can potentially impact the entire city to a varying degree, depending on interdependence and connectivity. So risks from one system do add risk to the entire ecosystem. So opportunities are here today and on the horizon for deploying these. There are very good business cases for many of these smart cities and IoT deployments and use cases, but the devil is really in the details. And by that, I mean scalability. With more scale comes more risk, right? The attack landscape is larger, the connectivity is more intense and difficult to manage, typically from a security perspective. And with that, you also have interdependence that you might overlook when doing risk analysis and risk management. There are a lot of differences between the way that the US and Europe and the Middle East and Asia and other parts of the world are adopting smart cities technologies. Sometimes the pilot program can be bottom up and come from maybe a chamber of commerce, a city council, or even a nonprofit initiative that will ask for a beta test or before a city finds funding to deploy at scale. So they'll have a proof of concept phase where they say, hey, you know, to my stakeholders, this is the option I want to pursue. And here is kind of the bottom line for why. And then they do a proof of concept. And if they like it, then they'll scale it and put more funding into it. So one example where I live in Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas in the United States, there's a nonprofit here called the North Texas Innovation Alliance. Their mission is to create the most connected, smart, and resilient region in the country, in the US. And their projects actually include digital infrastructure, mobility and transportation, economic development and entrepreneurship, the built environment, education and workforce, and sustainability and resilience. So you see these smart city deployments touching all kind of projects within a society and a city. And like I mentioned earlier, this includes an autonomous trucking hub for autonomous freight movement pilot programs. And so the city of Dallas is a very good security example for the world for a smart city deployment city. Elsewhere in the world, you might see the complete opposite. You might see a top-down centralized government effort where projects are kind of greenfield technologies. They'll build an entire built neighborhood, for instance, or a complete new mall landscape with an urban outdoor smart garden, right? These kinds of things where it's really top-down and the funding is there from the beginning and scalability is part of the project from the get-go. And that really depends on the initial market drivers that we just discussed. And at the end of the day, many of these projects are all about elevating the human experience, and some are purely driven by convenience or profit. The number one takeaway for this is not the amount of complexity or the various ways that people deploy smart cities technologies. The number one takeaway from this is that there are a lot of third parties involved. So there's a lot of third party ownership, and that means that the management and the risk is also shared by third parties and not typically owned by just the person that or the group that might purchase and deploy these solutions. So then for cybersecurity, what kind of challenges does that really produce? So the number one challenge that produces from a security perspective is visibility. We need to be able to produce monitoring and fusion of these smart cities deployments across different departments and business units within a city. So smart cities have limited visibility into this connectivity and number of deployed assets and networks. Therefore, they cannot adequately address their risk exposure and identify vulnerabilities in a proactive manner. This lack of insight leads to underinvestment in the security tools that you need to actively spot and diagnose threats and anomalies. When we see RFPs for smart cities deployments and we see vendors of smart cities technologies come in, typically there's not a requirement for security. Security sometimes does cost a little bit more. And if you are trying to be competitive in the market without a security requirement and building it in makes you less competitive from a cost and profit perspective, you might not build it in. So that's a market driver that has definitely been addressed in the US National Cybersecurity strategy this year. But it's not one that is totally built into the ecosystem today. So security by design is a conversation around building security into the devices. And then security at the RFP level is another proactive conversation going on now where we need to do better procurement of technologies and have security built in from the beginning and from the actual implementation rather than bolted on, quote unquote, after the fact. So then there's also this lack of visibility, lack of insights, and then lack of centralization. So again, whatever data is collected by the smart cities from their network systems or devices is typically siloed and not consolidated in one place. And some might argue that consolidation actually creates single points of failure. But back to limiting the frivolous kind of nature of data transferring all over the place, or people having unfettered access to data banks or data lakes, right? We need to have a concerted effort around who has access to what and what data is transmitted and transferring where, when, why, and how. And again, city planners need to have a central authority over that so that they understand the security risks and can manage those risks accordingly while deploying these use cases to benefit them and their business needs. And then lastly, in the US, we're really focused on zero trust. And again, when we talk about the complexity that I've just mentioned over the course of the market drivers, the use cases, the number of deployments, the number of different wireless networks you could be operating in your city, and the fact that an attack on one node could actually produce an outsized effect across your city, we really need to be thinking about enhancing where we double check and verify trusted relationships among these devices and make sure that the planning that goes into this development and these deployments actually takes into consideration having stopgaps and, for lack of a better term, defense in depth strategies. Which again, a very US term, but I think folks understand that means having multiple kind of goalies within your security system to catch potential invaders and attacks as they unfold. So what this all amounts to is really providing the situational awareness that we need for security. Many options are signature-based malware detection, learning from baseline anomaly detection variations for both communications data, but also process data. So the actual readings that a smart cities deployment might be reading, say in a building. If it's a temperature setting, you can alert on both the communications changes if that device is receiving commands that it shouldn't receive, or receiving commands out of the ordinary that they have baselined for that deployment. And you can also alert on things like, the parameters for this temperature should never exceed, 60 degrees Fahrenheit for something stored at a low temperature. And we now see that we're recording 85 degrees, right? So that's a process anomaly that you can actually marry or sync to your security anomalies to understand what to investigate and why. What security really provides for distributed IoT deployments is quality control. So there's a lot of protocols, like I mentioned, there's a lot of wireless networks that you can deploy various solutions on. That also means that there's a lot of different protocols out there operating at different levels in the stack. And these protocols are sometimes proprietary, sometimes not, sometimes standardized, sometimes not. And we need to have a growing protocol expertise in this suite of technologies, both for vertical coverage for smart cities, as well as horizontal coverage for the networks that we are connecting. In addition to what I focus on, which is, again, operational technology and industrial control systems, as we sometimes add these deployments to legacy technologies that are cyber physical in nature. So the streamlining of this security for many devices and business units really has to be, again, based on where the data is gathered, the transportation of that data, whether that's frivolous or centralized, and how do we secure that for dual use? And dual use, I mean, for communications analysis and security logging, as well as process analysis and understanding where things are out of the parameters set by that deployment. And we also need to realize that decentralized technologies like these deployments can adhere to centralized security policy. So I actually was talking to a city once, and I said, how do you do operational technology security, or how do you secure legacy systems? And they said, well, our water utility doesn't even have a SIM, so how do we do centralized security management there? But then they said that they go to one of their departments, and if their department doesn't adhere to their policies, then they have them sign a piece of paper that basically says they're liable for any issues that were to occur based on that technology or that deployment that they've adopted. But the big problem is when that comes down to maybe your 911, your 911, I guess you don't have 911 everywhere over the world, but your emergency services, who you call, your police forces, your medical, your emergency EMTs, and those kinds of people, you're not going to cut their budgets because they have adopted, an insecure IoT deployment. So this kind of liability question of who's at fault for not adhering to security policy set by a city really starts to break down very quickly. So to wrap up this kind of section, before we get into the differences between IoT and IIoT at the device level, smart city solutions are really about the value proposition that they add for either the society, the citizens, or the government, or the business units within a city. Typically, these either reduce operational expenditures through increased efficiency or demonstrably improve city services in a cost-effective way. Okay, so at the device level, this can get kind of confusing. One of my colleagues here, his name is Mike Dugin at Nozomi Networks, actually developed this flow chart for what is considered an IoT device. And so you can read through this chart, but basically you're asking, is it connected to a network? Does it interact with the real world, which typically means a physical outcome? Does it have an end user? Does it use specialized protocols? Like I just mentioned, there are tons of different protocols. Is it mission critical? And is it used in an OT process? And so this is really how we use the framework at Nozomi Networks to break down what devices are what and why we care about them and how to potentially do that centralized security policy work that I just mentioned. Taking this a step further, though, I really like these two slides that I found on the internet. And it really does delve into commercial versus industrial applications. So when we look at an IoT device, we understand that that's a smart device containing sensors that you can deploy in various locations, and those send information either to one another in a mesh capability where some of the devices act as gateways to actually push information to other nodes in the deployment, and none is a central authority. All right, this is a headless deployment. And another one is deployments where all of the nodes collect information and send that information to a cloud for processing and potentially application layer interaction with a software interface to that cloud capacity. The connectivity, like I mentioned, can be multiple different types of wireless networks, internet connections, Wi-Fi, mesh networks, RF, Bluetooth, cellular, et cetera. There's typically a user interface that I just mentioned where you can interact with the data and send messages and do a little bit of command and control to adjust some of the settings, whether that be an output for a physical change in the world or the environment, or an input to categorize and manage the data. And lastly, like I also mentioned, data processing, right? So it depends on the deployment to where you might send alerts or understand that data and use it for your ultimate use case. But on the right-hand side, there's another great table that breaks down IoT, the Internet of Things, versus IIoT, which we think of as the industrial Internet of Things. Again, this is this not debate, but this categorization of commercial versus industrial products and deployments. So industrial deployment, commercial we can understand as being, kind of the Nest thermostat in your house or the smart camera system that you have. And that's typically individual or small scale use. Industrial can be deployed as a subnet within an industrial environment, maybe a manufacturing facility, a healthcare facility, et cetera. And typically with mesh network capabilities where devices are headless and forward traffic from all the devices, and they can communicate with one another and process information on some basic level. But these colored categories in the middle here really help us to understand these caveats for these categories, where we have smart devices versus sophisticated machines. We have sensors with advanced controls and analytics versus simple applications with low risk impact. You can think of this as like calibration or temperature settings that are read only, right? So they don't write to anything. They just relay information back to some centralized, cloud interface or central kind of security operations center if it's a security function, or a command room, right? Command and control center, an operations center. So this table helps me often when I look at especially interoperability, right? Are they interacting with legacy systems that coexist already? Are they low scale or large scale networks in terms of scalability? Are they required to be resilient? Are they required to be ruggedized where they are deployed? And for maintenance, are they consumer preferred where a consumer can do maintenance or call somebody, or are they scheduled and organized on a deployment basis? Focusing again on industrial, the monitoring control of physical infrastructure and industrial operations is made easier through the use of smart sensors and actuators, as well as remote access and control. Many cyber physical industrial applications are remote. You can think of oil rigs, you can think of wind farms, things like that. And we can put sensors now further away and have that connectivity at a low cost, enhance the business operation, and it can also enhance security deployments depending on the solution. The other focus for industrial IIoT is a strong focus on machine-to-machine communication. So I've mentioned mesh networks a couple of times, but also big data and machine learning. So in a commercial deployment, you probably don't have big data analytics happening in your house, depending on your home. I don't want to make any assumptions. But for industrial applications, again, in high stakes industries, defense, manufacturing, healthcare, and others, connected mobility, right, the autonomous fleets, you do have big data and machine learning happening. And that's a key category that you can use to distinguish between the two. But at the end of the day, the underlying driver is still efficiency and reliability for operations. And the IIoT does encompass industrial applications, industrial robotics, medical devices, and even software-defined production processes. To me, any application larger than one device on a subnet or a VLAN is considered industrial IoT. The concerns that we have are similar to the rest of the concerns I've covered for IoT deployments and smart cities technologies, which is fragmentation, right? Dispersed and differentiated operations, standards and interoperability, which I mentioned on a code base, which we actually saw in the history of wireless connectivity, this kind of convergence of standards and open standards in that sense. And so we probably will see that down the line. But for right now, there's just a ton of different standards and protocols involved in IoT deployments. And one of the major concerns that have been surrounding this fragmentation is that the coexistence of these different standards, protocols, and architectures will ultimately lead to gaps for security. And so a couple of these, for example, are MQTT, which is the message queuing telemetry transport protocol, and constrained application protocol, CoAP, which might hinder interoperability. This gets a little bit into the weeds, so I'll leave it at that. But if you want more information, there's a lot of available resources online to help you break down these categories. Jumping into a specific overlay of what we look at for all of these connected systems, this slide really starts to demonstrate the complexity for security. So software vulnerabilities can be exploited to attack any system you see on the screen in these little bubbles. There's publicly searchable internet-connected devices and systems. Many people are familiar with Shodan. There are malicious activities where hackers are targeting systems just for data breach, for financial gain. There's system manipulation that can cause operational disruption, which could be product recalls from the actual vendor, or it could be sabotage processes based on a threat actor. There are system malfunctions that can result in the damage of devices and physical facilities, or injury to operators or people nearby. And there are also systems, again, compromised through the IT environment that are held at ransom for extortion that aren't technically targeting the IoT or the legacy systems underneath them, but are targeting the business use case at the top that deployed those systems for extortion. So you see smart grid connectivity, video surveillance, all of these deployments could exist in one city. They could all be owned, operated, and financed by different city departments, and they may or may not adhere to a centralized security policy. Some of them may be more at risk than others. It really depends on the vendor, the integration, the security features, and any kind of application you have over top of those. But typically the needs are on the left here. We need to track known vulnerabilities across all assets and devices and correctly determine patch priorities, and that could be for firmware or software updates. There's a lack of forensic tools to diagnose breaches and identify anomalies for the connectivity of these. So you might be able to do it on a case-by-case basis, but at a high level, it's very difficult to do it across the board. There's a lack of centralized data, which I've mentioned before, this aggregation and correlation across services and applications. It's very siloed. And there's a need for a non-disruptive approach to zero trust compliance, which is just understanding the deny by default or allow by default types of configurations between these networks of networks and systems of systems that we see deployed across cities. So what's the other kind of needs that we can address with securing smart cities, which is visibility that I've mentioned, of course, which then assesses the risk exposure from the risk landscape that is continuing to increase with these various deployments. There's a need of clear identification and prioritization of threats. Like I mentioned, on a silo or case-by-case basis, you might know what your security needs are, what your exposure is, and what your risk management looks like. But when you put these all together, you actually need to begin to prioritize these from a centralized, city secure, maybe a fusion center at the end of the day type of an approach. And if not, you also need a monitoring tool because there's so much data coming from all of these different deployments that it's kind of impossible to manually go through and assess all of those threats, vulnerabilities, potential malware identifications, et cetera, And again, there's pressure to reduce security risk in a constant changing threat landscape that includes these targeted attacks. So I don't really need to rattle off the amount of witnessed attacks or bots or incidents we've seen across cities. I think that it's really relevant and in the news. And if you don't know of any of those attack examples, you can definitely dig into those on your own. To wrap up this slide, again, we really need to see integration of security approaches to these multi-vendor, multi-owner smart cities deployments across smart cities environments. This requires regular monitoring and detection in case of a malware infection, better threat visibility and early detection for anomalies, proactive prevention of threats and attacks between IT and OT. And when I say OT, I just mean the legacy systems that are behind your waste management, behind your water management, behind even some of your electric smart grid and microgrid capabilities. We need to secure data transfer. Like I mentioned, frivolous data should be null. And we also need to secure server and application protection. So I mentioned that integration piece where you have an interface. A lot of folks that deploy cloud technologies kind of assume that if it's in the cloud, it's quote unquote secure by default. That's a myth that is starting to go away, but it's not completely eroded yet from our conscious. So we really need to be careful when you think about cloud deployments to understand the shared risk responsibility model. Every single one of the big cloud providers has this. Typically, people don't reference it enough, and I don't think that they understand the breakdown of responsibilities in that shared responsibility model for cloud deployments. And it's something that we need to revisit and also ask for receipts. I tell people this a lot when I do consulting or talks about cloud security and that shared responsibility model. Don't just check a box and say there is a shared responsibility model. Ask, how do you verify this? How do you enforce the portions of the security that you are responsible for on the cloud provider end? They have to document these things, but they don't have to provide that documentation unless you ask for it. So definitely ask for more from your vendors in terms of security that they say that they deploy and verify. Just breaking this down a little bit further, the healthcare example is an easy one to look at and capture in this visual as essentially a hospital that's connected in this way is a campus that is really a mini or micro smart city at the end of the day. So if you see, again, just like the last slide, in terms of the siloed deployments from a city, these may be less siloed, but there are still various deployments of smart cities and sensor technologies that you can deploy in a hospital setting. So on the building side, connecting your building, you might see your vertical transportation or your escalators and elevators, your power, lighting, HVAC, and energy management, your CCTV and security recording and access controls, badging for your doors, the opening and closing of your doors. All of those things could be in a connected environment, as well as all of the IoT, so the Internet of Medical Things assets used for patient care typically, or patient experience, remote care devices, monitoring devices for your actual diagnostics for your healthcare, networking equipment, mobile client devices where you check in on an iPad or your doctor takes your vitals with an iPad or a transient device, right, that moves around the hospital, monitors, and asset tracking. So there's a lot of tracking that goes on so they don't lose people or things or equipment in these environments. So back to the same kind of example that we saw at a high level with these multiple siloed deployments from a city. When we look at a hospital campus, you have the exact same type of concerns. There's no way to do advanced warning or prioritization from a security perspective with these various deployments and networks. And it's difficult to do proactive security before a situation impacts you in a negative way. So we do need a faster and more resource efficient way to troubleshoot with these various connections, devices, network connectivity, and data. We need better forensic tools, and we need to keep track of all of these contracts, right? So there's many different vendors. There might be remote access from a vendor. There's different maintenance periods. Again, we really need to ask more of our vendors about what the security risks look like, what security is enabled by default, what's disabled by default, what vendor access they might have remotely, and what responsibility they might share with you for securing those technologies, and what their patch schedule looks like, what their uploadability for firmware looks like, what their disclosure process looks like, right? A lot of questions we need to ask beyond, can you meet my use case that I want to deploy in my city or my hospital? On the IT side, we need comprehensive visibility again for all of this risk exposure that IT folks are maybe not totally versed in yet, depending on where they work or what industry that they've been in for the last X amount of years. Again, the priority problem is very difficult here. On a case-by-case basis, you might understand the risks to somebody getting into your HVAC system, but how do you begin to prioritize that against all of your other IoT assets that are actually used for day-to-day patient care that could impact people's lives? Again, across the board, there just needs to be a realization that these things are competing for coverage, for visibility, for security, and that this landscape continues to grow at the same time that we see targets that tolerate no downtime or don't tolerate impacts to human health and environmental safety being targeted from a ransomware perspective or from highly tailored cyber attacks. I wanted to feature here that Nozomi Networks has a Smart Cities lab coming soon, and we'll have some demos online for this. It's not a product feature capability or anything like that from our solution, but it is a really cool lab that we have been building in our headquarters in Mendrisio, Switzerland. So this is just a cute little feature for that upcoming. And then I wanted to sort of jump into some of the cloud caveats that I began to discuss, because I think this is really important to understand. We understand that security in the cloud is a separate deployment of cloud utility. And this is really where we're tracking in the future, regardless of the deployments, is being able to not have any scalability issues or bandwidth issues in analyzing data really does require a cloud deployment for security. The virtualized infrastructure is more cost effective and resilient, just like it is for the actual technology deployment and the data use case. It typically requires outside expertise. And this really gets down to the negligent insider continues to be the most commonly identified threat actor in our world. And that, I mean, control systems and OT, this is pretty true. I think this will remain true in IoT. It's a little too soon to tell. But that does mean the person accidentally making a configuration change or accidentally connecting something to a network that is also connected to the public internet, right? So that's a pretty obvious initial access vector for that landscape. These kinds of accidents happen all the time, and we refer to those as the negligent insider. And so when we talk about, minimizing frivolous data, sometimes people just say, well, let's put everything in one place and give everyone access to it. Also not the best route to go for your deployments and for cloud security. So these are just things to be aware of. Last year, the CISA, CS2AI is a group, and they produce a study every year. And their 2022 study revealed that the few companies who reported zero intrusions in industrial applications were more likely to adhere to a couple of best practices. The first one was they were more likely to use orchestration and automation and have security tracking and reporting in place. That's something that is really only applicable in the cloud if you have those multiple diverse deployments across the city. If you have one or two, that's a different conversation. But those examples on the slides before, where you have smart metering for water, waste, energy, mobility, et cetera, that complexity really does require orchestration and automation and security reporting and tracking. This report showed that those that had those in place were also more likely to have 100% centralized visibility in their security operations center. So I referenced the potential to build a fusion center, but again, this decentralized nature of these deployments with different use cases, department ownership, funding, and operations and management, et cetera, really is a giant risk without centralized visibility from a security standpoint. And these folks were more prepared earlier to accommodate working from home during the pandemic. I know that seems like a silly caveat for security, but if you remember, amidst all the other trends that did take place during the COVID-19, the overview of the COVID-19 event, security was a big issue with people working from home and being remotely able to access things or not access things. It really did throw a wrench in some dynamic business models, to be honest. So network security is not going away, but automating and potentially making things less time consuming so that we can find kind of needle in the haystack approaches to security, that we can do preventative security and reduce the overall impact of a potential risk before it's too late, is really where we're trending in the smart cities domain. And then, one thing that I can't get out of any presentation without hammering home is segmentation. So segmentation continues to be the way that we build security into a lot of operational technology domains, but it can also be applied across multiple layers of smart cities deployments, where we look at asset management and maintaining different inventories and, subnets for specific use cases. And then all of this taken together from a security perspective enables earlier threat detection. You can know when devices and nodes are added or manipulated, and you can also note when misconfiguration occurs if you're doing that centralized and automated security. And that really overall decreases your mean time to respond to an incident, which is the best kind of scenario for security. If you're not going to be able to have 100% perimeter security, which we know is kind of an old way to think about security, then you need to decrease the mean time to respond and reduce the overall severity of any incident, or like I like to call a security event, before it becomes an incident. I'm definitely going to leave enough time for questions at the end, so I'm just going to pop through one or two more slides. This is just a way to help people understand cloud deployments. I think when we talk about the cloud, we think of this monolithic empire that's built by a couple of providers, and that's true, but it's also not true. So when we think about companies on the left, here are some trends. 30% of global institutions plan to heavily outsource security, 44% are looking to enable turnkey solutions, and 67% have identified a need to augment staff and resource abilities. And this just applies to cybersecurity. And then industry specific, which is industries operating industrial or legacy and enterprise together. The number one spending priority, according to that CISA survey that I referenced from last year, is control system cybersecurity technology solutions. But their fourth priority is virtual or cloud SOC operations and services. So these can be combined. And their concern typically is that cloud-based assets are not located with the enterprise-owned network. So they don't have full control over, both parts of that shared responsibility model, because ultimately your cloud provider has access to your data and is also responsible for a portion of that security. So that's just the security perspective on the left-hand side. But on the right is typically what you can expect to manage, or you'll have a third party manage. And I think this is important to understand before we get to the shared risk, because security practitioners want to jump into the risk model, but this is the ownership model. So on the left-hand side, when you have on premises, you obviously manage everything from top to bottom here in your stacks, in your technology and your management, your maintenance, et cetera. Infrastructure as a service, you start to see a little bit less management of your own technology and deployments, and a little bit more management from your provider or third party. Platform as a service, you're basically just doing the top level analysis, communications, understanding, and use cases, and your provider is really responsible for everything. And then software as a service is exactly what it sounds like. This is really kind of the most predominant deployments that we see today, where you're just paying a subscription over time, and you may have hardware to implement with an integrator on site, but really most of the service is managed by the provider of that deployment. So again, it's really interesting that some people will, not people, but some cities we've seen deploy technologies without really chewing on what they manage and what they don't manage from a just deployment perspective. And then again, to the shared responsibility from a security perspective, they really ignore typically beyond the integration what they have to own, maintain, and secure over time. So the last thing I'll mention is nothing to do really with my company, but just an example of a large scale energy provider that wanted to adopt smart sensors. And so they deployed a countrywide smart metering deployment. They wanted to be able to detect any manipulation anomalies in their traffic patterns and their smart meter behavior. And they wanted that operational visibility to be centralized at an HQ or a security operations center. And we did that deployment with them. We went live during COVID and scaled up with them. And so we were able to, if you look in the bottom hand corner from a visibility perspective, we went from we were with about 5 million smart meters, and the total to scale up to is 7.5 million smart meters to centralize that data and visibility from a security standpoint. So happy to talk about how we deploy and what the business challenges are when we work one-on-one with customers across the board in different regions, et cetera. But this is just a snapshot to give you an idea of how, organizations that do deploy large sensor technologies are beginning to understand the business challenges that security might also provide for them beyond just the need or the use case for an interesting deployment. And with that, I will open up to questions. I know that I have a couple here in the chat already. Somebody asked for the slides. I'm happy to share them. They're not too secret for me, so we can definitely get those out to you. Somebody said here that it is surprising you mentioned security isn't top of mind for the companies that supply equipment for smart cities. Is this simply a cost issue or are there other factors? So there are a lot of unregulated markets. I love to remind people that cybersecurity itself is an unregulated market. So nobody is telling the vendors in security what they can or can't sell, what they can or can't do, what they must verify to. There's some, SOC compliance you can get. There's some product compliance you can get with like ISA for vendors. But at the end of the day, vendors that compete on smart cities deployments and sensors typically were racing to the bottom to have the cheapest sensor to deploy at scale with centralized management, but not centralized security. So the big thing that we've seen over the last couple of years has really been dashboards. Everyone loves visualization and they love dashboards. And when we began to centralize things from a sensor deployment use case where you could have more efficient energy usage because you understood the demand and consumption from your lighting and your HVAC and your other controls, that became a systems of systems that was really just a visualization of dashboards. And nobody really started to peel back that layer of visualization and say, wait a minute, we're integrating the understanding of operations, but we're not integrating any of the security backhaul from these networks, from these communications, and their potential supply chain risks versus their potential manipulation. And so security really wasn't a question when these deployments were purchased over the last couple of years. They're not, the adoption isn't massive either. So it really depends on the region, how many quote unquote smart cities are really deployed and then deployed at scale. So this isn't a scenario where it's too little, too late. It's really a scenario where the dialogue is beginning to change, but it has to change at the buyer's end. So people wanting to deploy smart cities capabilities with security in mind need to be willing to A, ask for that security, and B, verify that security, and C, pay for that security. And so that's really where we're going to across the board for these markets. Okay, I think I don't see any more questions. Do any of my moderators or friends of the organizers have anything else for me? Okay. With that, I'm going to end the talk. I know it's a little bit early. I do tend to talk fast. You can find me on LinkedIn, Danielle Jablansky. I'm happy to answer questions, try to provide resources if you can't find anything that I mentioned throughout the talk. And again, I will absolutely provide these slides to Device Authority. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.